Life is equal value, and everyone deserves an opportunity to flourish. They defend those who lack the protection of law and are unable to protect themselves. They offer the poor health care and educational opportunities that they need to thrive. They offer the saving grace of Jesus to all while defending everyone's unalienable right to exercise the religion of their own choosing. Greg's help was invaluable in our defeat of question 2, so I asked Greg to give us some of his observations on that battle. Greg?
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Ann. Thank you all for inviting me to join you here today. It is really an honor for me to be addressing this victorious contingent in Massachusetts after an electoral season that didn't have a lot of victories for those who fight for the cause of life. I went around telling people last summer and fall that question 2 in Massachusetts was either the first or second most important electoral question in 2012, the only other contender being the presidential election. I said this with great conviction, not only because I was trying to raise money, but also because I thought it was true. Sometimes the things we've accomplished by great effort in the past can start to seem like no great thing with time and with distance, and as we forget the details of what was at stake and the effort that we put in. So my chief goal here today is to remind you of how important your victory in Massachusetts was, and how greatly you all are to be honored for your faithful work to defeat question 2. It's fitting we're here on the day of the March for Life, 40 years after the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion up until birth here in America. Because the proponents of doctor-prescribed suicide have learned a lot from the legacy of Roe. In fact, the clear hope of the fraud and compassionate choices is to obtain the Roe v. Wade of doctor-prescribed suicide. As many of you surely know, there is a concept in Supreme Court jurisprudence known as emerging consensus. The idea is that when the court is considering a question on which the plain text of the Constitution is not clear, and on which the jurisprudence of the court is not clear, they should look to the states to see if there's a consensus emerging in the states on the question. An important example of this is the court's decision on the juvenile death penalty in Roper v. Simmons in 2005, which held on the question of emerging consensus that, quote, it is not so much the number of these states that is significant, but the consistency of the direction of change. Compassionate Choices thinks emerging consensus is its ticket to the Roe v. Wade of doctor-prescribed suicide. Or it did until it met this crowd from Massachusetts. After its win in Oregon in 1994, it pursued for what must have seemed like an eternity its Oregon +1 strategy. It wasn't until 2008, 14 years later, that they finally got Washington State as the second state to legalize doctor-prescribed suicide. Montana State Supreme Court followed in 2009, and at this point, they were convinced that the rest of the country would fall like dominoes, and they would have established that there's an emerging consensus in the states on doctor-prescribed suicide. Listen to this blog post from Peg Sandine. After 2009, they went to Vermont, and they worked very hard there, both in 2010 during the electoral season, they spent in campaigns, and then also in the legislative sessions in 2011. So listen to this blog post from Peg Sandine, who's the executive director of the Death with Dignity Political Action Fund, in a blog post titled Itinerary Vermont, and it was published on December 9, 2010. She says, I had a whirlwind trip to Vermont last week with an itinerary that included a meeting with Governor-elect Shumlin, strategy sessions with local organizers and lobbyists, dinners with supporters, an interview with a potential field team director, and a tour of Vermont State House with its beautiful gold dome. Our meeting with the Governor-elect was short and direct. He opened the meeting by saying that he made a campaign commitment to work on death with dignity, and he was a man of his word. He promised to work with us to ensure passage of a death with dignity law in Vermont in the Vermont legislature. She goes on to talk about some of the details, and then she says, this trip was everything I had imagined and more. And she says in bold, Vermont will be the next state with a death with dignity law. Every element is in place. Every player has a plan of action. Every commitment has been fulfilled. Everyone interested in death with dignity should turn their eyes to Vermont. Remember, this was in December of 2010. Fortunately for us, Peg had seriously miscalculated. She had seriously underestimated the very tenacious Mary Beerworth of Vermont Right to Life, who I'm sure some of you know, and her ragtag coalition of pro-lifers, disabilities rights activists, and atheist, Buddhist, liberal Democrats. She underestimated how far a little energy in defense of human dignity can go. Now let's put this in perspective of your victory in Massachusetts. When the proponents of Massachusetts began their effort, they were certain that they were going to be following on a victory in Vermont. They were sure that they had, that they were going to have, they turned their eyes to Vermont and they were sure that they would be not disappointed. But they were disappointed. So even in the beginning, we were that far ahead because the folks in Vermont had been so strong. But even so, they thought the polling in Massachusetts was such that they could not but win in 2012. Then they would go on to Hawaii and New Mexico and New Jersey and Connecticut, and one by one establish an emerging consensus in the states. But then there's you. Massachusetts citizens for life and its supporters would not give up. You would not be discouraged by improbably bad odds, and the rest is history. Again, they were foiled, and again, the emerging consensus seems to be that you just can't kill people. So let me turn for a minute to the substance of the issue. The substance of the issue is the inviolable dignity of the human person, of human life. Here we are to march today for the protection of the unborn, to defend their inviolable dignity. And we envision an America in which everyone's right to life is defended and protected. But the America in which we live is one in which the rights of the weak and the inconvenient are subverted for the sake of the rights of the strong. A column I read recently at the online journal The Catholic Thing reminded me of an experience I had in Boston, actually, many years, almost 2 decades ago. Matthew Hanley, in a column entitled "Charity to Match Our Poverty," had the following to say. From time to time, I'd visit a few people at a secular nursing home in Baltimore, and in some respects, the human misery I saw there affected me more than what I'd seen in, say, rural Africa. He continues, perhaps my subjective assessment of our homegrown misery was heightened by this nursing home's surrounding bleakness. It was located in a distinctively uncharming, drug-infested corridor of Charm City. This was no old folks' home. Many residents were relatively young and incapacitated for various reasons, there for the long haul. They had 4 walls and 3 squares a day. Any sense of hope and meaning seemed much scarcer, and they often endured their torment alone. I don't necessarily say the staff was deliberately inattentive, but human warmth was conspicuous by its absence. It simply wasn't part of the job description. The constant din of the TV in the rooms might have distracted, but yielded no real succor, and nor diminished the lingering odors. As I read this, I remembered a trip I took in the 1990s with a priest. I was in seminary at the time, and he was raising money for a project he was working on. So we went up to Vermont, and then we came down to Boston to visit with an elderly woman who had been a supporter of this project of his. This poor woman was very old, and she didn't seem to remember very much, but she did seem to have a pretty clear notion that this particular priest had a particular interest in her checkbook. So she sort of clumsily hid it in a drawer, sort of in our plain sight. We went with her to visit some of her friends, and we asked the staff if Father could celebrate Mass for those who were interested. They seemed slightly confused by this idea, but they agreed, and we hastily made a makeshift chapel out of a common area. Few of these elderly women seemed to have much of an idea what was going on or where they were. None of them were accompanied by family or friends on this Sunday afternoon. After Mass, we packed up and headed back to the seminary. At the time, I considered this one of the most disturbing experiences I had in my life. It was partly because of the episode of the checkbook, where I was sort of surprised by this woman's effort to protect her assets from this priest. But the second element was that I couldn't shake the sense that these elderly people, these mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, were abandoned to an efficient warehousing system. This memory has stuck with me ever since. Keep in mind and understand that the proponents of death with dignity look at realities like this and decide it would be better to be dead. It is not a wholly unreasonable inclination, but it is a failure of imagination. What if we could, rather than wishing to be dead, choose a different reality in which the dignity of the human person is respected and honored? We can. Consider the rest of Hanley's article. Across town, he says, in another blighted neighborhood not far from Johns Hopkins Hospital, the missionaries of charity operated a hospice for those with AIDS who had nowhere to turn. I'd occasionally stayed there on night duty. The surrounding commotion, the blaring music, the confrontational outbursts, the sirens and whatnot going on all hours of the night was hard to tune out. But the orderly environment inside could not have been more different than the rundown nursing home across town. The sisters had created an oasis of peace in that rough and tumble zone of inhospitality. The patients were not in great shape. Many were not long for this world. Yet they were welcomed with attentiveness and regard. The care was holistic, stretching beyond what was necessary for mere subsistence." End quote. The patients at this hospice run by sisters were treated in accordance with their dignity, and that made all the difference. In our society, the elderly, just as the unborn, are too often treated as an inconvenience. In the case of the unborn, as we memorialize today, they are too often summarily executed for the sake of convenience. Fortunately, in the case of the elderly, things have not come to that yet. But they have not come to that thanks to the efforts of people like you to defend the dignity of human life at all stages. While we were working to defeat question 2, we asked several national pro-life organizations to help us by sending emails to their constituents in Massachusetts. Many of them agreed and were very helpful. One group, though, said to us that they were pro-life at conception, so they couldn't help us. I don't want to denigrate any of the national pro-life groups who do wonderful work on all kinds of issues, especially to defend the unborn, nor do I want to begrudge some of them their particular and exclusive focus on abortion. But you all have learned in Massachusetts and understand that if not all of us have human dignity that is protected by the law, then none of us have human dignity protected by the law. So I ask all of you to remember your experience in Massachusetts and to continue to be committed to the defense of human life at every stage. Whenever anyone suggests that the issue of doctor-prescribed suicide is not important or not urgent, remember Massachusetts and remember question 2. Thank you all for what you do in the service of life.